Okay, this is called Red Teaming Probably Isn't For You, and this was written and designed as a screed to everyone who thinks that red teaming is amazing and awesome. However, y'all are here, so you're pretty much aware that there are other things that need to be done. I've been trying to figure out how I want to change the talk with you as the audience, because I think that there's more of an engaging conversation to be had. I haven't quite decided, so I'm banking on you guys jumping up and saying I should talk about something different or go in a different direction. Deal? Cool. Okay. Quick standard contents disclaimer. I am not speaking on behalf of my employer in any way, shape, or form. None of my opinions are theirs, even the ones that are absolutely right and incontrovertible. A little background. My name is Toby. I have been doing InfoSec for 18 or 19 years. I've done mostly defense, incident response, project evaluation, intrusion analysis. I've built a couple SOCs. I've done some other various things. Currently, I'm running a red team at a Fortune 50 company. I've done all sorts of different things, and as the people who can't avoid being called friends of mine in the audience will tell you, I have trouble staying on a single side of any argument ever. So you're all familiar with what red teaming is. I don't have to talk about it. You're all aware of the fact that it's the new cool thing. Into the microphone, sorry. You're all aware that it's the new cool thing and that everyone thinks it is super sexy. You know, the point I'd make here for this audience as opposed to other audiences is that red teaming actually does have some significant values if you stop looking at it as the generally accepted definition. And I'll show you the definitions that I've been using and that I think have significant value, whether you are actually ready for the full use or whether you even need it or not. The origins of red teaming. This is some of the things that I've found fascinating. So the concept of red teaming has been around for a very long time. At a basic concept, you've got this going back from the phrase actually, literally, the devil's advocate. By the way, random tidbit. Turns out that John Paul II removed the role of devil's advocate from the Catholic Church in the early 80s, late 70s, I believe. And prior to that, there'd been this long stretch of almost no saints being canonized. And all of a sudden, when he changed it, there were suddenly lots and lots of saints showing up again. So maybe there was some value in having that level of filtering. The Stoic philosophy, premeditatio malorum, the concept of thinking ahead about all the bad things that could happen. All of us do this a bit. But this has been around for a long time. The thing is that this is very distinct from penetration testing. None of this says pen test. None of this says attack blindly. This is all about a very different set of concepts and a way of doing things. And they come down to two different kinds of activities. From my perspective, one, alternative analysis. This is somebody playing devil's advocate. This is somebody coming in and saying, have you looked at it differently? Have you thought about it differently? What are some of the structured ways we can do this? This is something that I think everyone believes they're good at, and almost no one is actually good at, especially because it requires you to see your own blind spots, and as we know, it's really easy to find your own blind spots, right? The second is red cell, or threat emulation, and this is closer to what people actually do, though frequently what they're calling threat emulation really is not. And I'll get into that in just a second. So, for some definitions, these are the ones that I've pulled and the definitions that I actually really like when talking about red teaming. And I will read you one because I don't know that the slides are actually readable from where you are. My preferred one. Defined loosely, red teaming is the practice of viewing a problem from an adversary or competitor's perspective. The goal of most red teams is to enhance decision-making, either by specifying the adversary's preferences or strategies, or simply by acting as a devil's advocate. Notice there's nothing about shells in there. Nothing about attacking. There's just purely understanding and thinking like the adversary and looking at things from a different perspective. What red teaming isn't? These are the things that most of the time, and this is where you get into the rant. I will absolutely own this. This is a rant. These are the things that I hear again and again. Last year at DEF CON, I was saying, yeah, I run a red team, and I got these fascinating definitions. People would say, oh, yeah, I'm on a red team, or oh, we have a red team. I'd say, really, that's fascinating. What are the things that you do? What are the different pieces of it? And they gave me a huge number, and I'll mention some of them in a couple minutes. But red teaming has nothing to do with shooting down all the ideas you don't like. It's not a chance to just step all over somebody's thoughts. It's not just hacking everything gratuitously and at will. These are most of the things that people end up talking about. It's also, by the way, not something that can be scripted and automated. And I am personally a huge fan of detection testing tools and the new capabilities that are out there for control validation. They are not red teaming. They are in no way the same thing, and they have great value, and they are completely separate. So, talked a little bit about background. These are some of the things. Do you really need a red team? Does somebody need it? I'm actually not going to go through this because I think most of you are aware of this sort of argument against red teaming. Is that fairly comfortable? Thank you. No, I'll take nods. That'll work. Otherwise, I'm going to start asking philosophical questions. Who wants to give me the contradiction or the counter-argument to the ontological argument for the existence of God? Nobody? Come up with a better... Say again? Over beers. Come up with better questions than I have then. So the thing about red teams is they are expensive. If you're doing it right, they are not cheap. And there's a great analysis of this by the Gruck. I love it. It is absolutely worth reading. And what it comes down to is you really cannot afford a real red team because a real red team looks like an attacking environment, an attacker, and an attacker. They're expensive. And so if you think you're doing emulation blindly, you're probably missing some things. The best you can hope for is intentionally taking shortcuts. So should you have an actual red team? Do you actually need one? This is where I actually want to talk a little bit about what's appropriate and the value that there is for us. And in doing this for defense specifically, I would assert that the alternative analysis side of this is something that is beneficial to everyone. Across the board, every part of defense, every part of information security would benefit from the alternative analysis. A friend of mine, a coworker of mine, used to say, the real question is, where is Belgium? When you're looking for how an attacker is going to function, you should be looking for where Belgium is, reference World War II. You need to be thinking about how somebody is going to go around your defenses, and you need to be thinking about how your reasoning is going to fall down, and you need somebody who is practiced at it, and you should be practiced at doing this. I'll get into ways of doing it in a little bit. Most companies don't actually need adversary simulation for quite a while, and I absolutely am going to give full credit for this to Kelly, who is sitting in the audience, because she is one of the people who has talked again and again about the way companies are drawn to the new sexy, and also to the fact that the basics really do end up giving you the massive value that you need again and again. Did I summarize that about right? Is that cool? Okay. By the way, I do have a reference here to Red Team Journal. He's got great materials. He's got a good training course on alternative analysis and red teaming in general. I really recommend it. And the laws of red teaming are actually really funny that he has up there. And they're well thought out. So if you actually have the basics done, if you're actually already doing vulnerability management, by the way, show of hands if who wants to admit it, how many of you are already doing vulnerability management at your company? Great. Now, keeping hands up, hold on, keeping hands up. How many of you are also already doing log collection analysis and response? Nice. Now, how many of you have consistent penetration tests being done using varying vendors and you're fixing everything that comes through? Yeah. So, yeah, I'm setting a high bar. I admit I might be filtering a little bit for the audience. But once you've got, yeah. How many of us are liars was the question. Yeah. But once you've got these three, then you're at the point where you can start talking reasonably about doing adversary simulation. Now it's where it actually gets interesting. If you're not doing these three, there's really not as much value of having somebody come in and say, I can poke you this way, I can poke you this way, I can, it just doesn't work. So if you actually do have the basics, you can decide on whether you want to go one direction or another. The place that I really want to encourage everyone here to explore is the alternative analysis side. The attack modeling, there's lots of material on, and I'll talk about my biases and my expectations on attack modeling because I think that in general it's done way too haphazardly. But the alternative analysis is really where it gets interesting. So, very quickly on attack modeling, because I want to get through it. It's simple to do attack modeling. This is where I was getting the interesting answers. So, oh, you're on a red team. Oh, that's great. Yeah, what's your definition? Red teaming is penetration testing with social engineering and physical attacks. Red teaming is no holds barred penetration testing and attacking. By the way, anyone have a problem with the concept of no holds barred attacking? Thank you. You're going to get shot. Or you're going to end up shooting somebody because it's no holds barred after all, so it must be allowed, right? If it's no holds barred, that means that I can go and kidnap somebody's family and extort them, right? That's reasonable. That's no holds barred, and that's how we do it. We'll stop there. So, if you want to do actual attack modeling, this gets into a lot of information that you need to collect, and a lot of it actually comes out of what would nominally be threat intelligence as a starting point. Do you know which attackers you actually want to model? So the analogy I've used, and one of the things that we've been very successful at doing is building a strong relationship between the defenders and the attackers. And the way we did that first is that I looked over at the defenders and found the ones with the skills that we needed and recruited them as volunteers. And a couple of them are in the audience. And it was a tremendous value. The other is that rather than stating this as an adversarial thing, I've started describing it as a sparring partner. The purpose of a red team is to be a sparring partner. How many of you have taken martial arts? Self-defense classes? Seen movies about martial arts or fighting? Okay. So, you know, in every movie they have the training montage, and the character who's being trained, their trainer brings in somebody who fights like their opponent so that they can practice against them. This is what a red team does. This is attack modeling. Attack modeling is standing up and fighting the way a specific opponent would fight. Can you do that if you don't know how that opponent actually fights? No. So where do you start? You have to figure out how they fight and which ones you want to spar like. You don't want to be fighting like Muhammad Ali if your opponent is George Foreman. Well, actually you do, but that's a separate topic. You don't want to be Sugar Ray. Yeah, maybe not fighting like Sugar Ray. So you don't want to just be a super APT. You need to know what they actually want. You need to understand what is likely to be the opponents, because really the sexy, cool opponents that everyone's paying attention to probably don't care about most companies in this room. Well, actually that's not true. Given the companies that I see in this room, they may actually care about a large number of you. But in general, most of the APTs don't care about the majority of companies. And so this is an important thing to understand, is maybe the biggest threat you have is a very general style of malware. Maybe that's the thing to start with. What level of subtlety can your defenders notice? I mean, are your defenders really going to be paying attention between exfil over HTTPS with AWS targets versus Google targets? Is that going to matter to them? Are they really going to care about the differences in the URI? Is this really going to make a big difference? Is it going to matter whether you are doing encryption with RSA or Diffie-Hellman? It's not a big deal. If your defenders aren't paying attention to that level of subtlety, it doesn't matter. Finally, how long of an engagement is actually going to be useful to you? Well, this gets into some interesting questions. And we've played with engagement lengths. I've wanted to do longer and longer engagements. I think they're valuable. But if you don't have logs and documentation or traces going back to the full length of your engagement, your defenders aren't going to be able to learn anything from the activity that happened before they have visibility. They're not going to be able to go back and say, oh, we should have seen that, and we should have seen that, and we should have seen that. My apologies. I should have seen that. I didn't. Okay, so let's talk about the critical analysis, the alternative analysis. This is, I think, the interesting space. Explain the exact methods. This is where it gets challenging. Can you actually explain the exact method you use to ensure that you're actually doing critical analysis again? This is why it is challenging, and this is where it gets strange. Can you actually enumerate the weaknesses in the approach that you use in the areas that you're struggling with personally? Not as an organization, personally. Can you talk about your own challenges in identifying alternative analysis and doing critical analysis? How many of you, on a regular basis, look at your political views and then try to strongly and in a committed fashion argue the points of the opposite side of the political spectrum? Not from the, well, if I were a stupid, lazy, greedy, horrible person, then I would obviously think the way these people. No. honestly saying they think this way and I'm trying to extrapolate why and how. It's not easy. It takes a lot of work and it's a little uncomfortable. And if it's not uncomfortable, you're not doing it right. My favorite. When was the last time you said thank you to somebody who tore apart one of our most closely held ideas? Not something you were casually enthusiastic about, but your deeply held ideas. Week ago? Month ago? Within the last 6 months? Yeah? Okay. Yeah. This morning at breakfast. Getting started with the alternative analysis. You know, the interesting thing about this is that there are really good sources on teaching alternative analysis, and it turns out the canonical one is the US Army, which you wouldn't necessarily think, but they have detailed training, and they actually have a extended training course that's available for people who are in the military. I've heard occasionally about people who are in government work in general, and DoD, DOJ being able to attend, but I haven't figured out how one does that yet. If you're investing in teaching, you'll get significant value in this, and this is something that, whatever your topic is, this is a place I really strongly believe in doing this. The question is, how do you play devil's advocate? How do you institutionalize the 10th man position? The 10th person concept is one that came out of the 7-Day War, after the 7-Day War in Israel, and the idea is that if you have 10 people in a room and 9 of them agree, the 10th person is obligated to disagree no matter their opinion. This is, I think, fascinating and useful. You need to rotate through who the 10th person is, but it is a tremendously valuable thing. How do you flip the sides of arguments? We've done this, Robbie and I actually have done this on occasion, though generally over drinks, and we'll switch political views. We'll trade them back and forth, and we'll sit down and start trying to go from the opposite perspective. We usually end up laughing, but it's a fascinating thing to do, especially to be strict about your language and to really embrace it. If you've got people in your organization who are new to InfoSec and are perhaps a little bit zealous and dismissive about your employees or other things, this is a great way to call them out on their implicit biases. This is where you get things like, well, of course they're just being lazy, and if I didn't really care about making sure that things were secure, then I would do X. This is where you have the ability to call that language out and actually catch some of those biases and how people are functioning. Now, I have no idea how much time we actually have left, so I'm kind of blasting through these fairly fast. 12 minutes? Great, then I will continue blasting through. So, if you actually want to do attack modeling, I have a preferred kill chain. It came out of FusionX's research. They presented it 2 years ago at Black Hat. 2 or 3 years ago. Think about how you're going to do this. Figure out how you're going to get started and how you're going to, what position you want to start from, and then where your targets actually are. I'll give you a hint. Shell access is never an end game. It's not relevant. The purpose is you're trying to achieve something. Maybe your purpose is to sow discontent. Maybe your purpose is to disrupt a company enough that you can come in and replace them. Think about what your goals are and think over the longer term. There are fascinating things in this space that are worth playing with. Read about adversaries. Think about what they want. By the way, the carrot work from MITRE, along with the attack matrix, is really interesting here. And there's a bunch of fairly useful work that gives some really nice models. I'm still trying to figure out how we're going to apply carrot, but I think it's fascinating. Define the resources. Look at the list of things that they have access to. What do they want from you? Maybe you're just a stepping stone. So for instance, we've got at least a couple companies in here that are beautiful stepping stones. And he's not even catching the smile. He's just glaring at me. Okay. There are others as well, but he's in front. Maybe you're only a stepping stone to get further inside of other companies. Maybe you are just a path. Maybe you are the end goal. Maybe you need to be looking at all the paths into your environment. Maybe not. Think about the resources that they're actually going to have, and think about the timeline. This is something where, when I say think about the timeline, I mean really, really reconsider the definition of what you think a campaign works under. Dark Hotel is one of my favorite APT campaigns, and the reason is that the oldest versions of software they found for it are from 2006. It was discovered in 2014. This is the one where across various hotels in Asia and India, they were implementing wireless LAN attacks in 2010, 2009, 2008, and they were using malware that went silent and dormant for months on end before actually speaking. Think about what you were worrying about as a security person in 2006. Not malware that stayed resident and silent for months and months and months on end, not wireless LAN attacks at this scale. Who was in 2006 handing out burner laptops to anyone who was traveling? So when you're thinking about your timelines as an attacker, think about if that was happening in 2006, what is the timeline for these attacks now? How many years are they going to be playing? Good uses. Having gone through the problems of what red teaming is and isn't, there are some significant uses, and I believe in them. Provide skeptical analysis for anything. This is not, by the way, just for security. There's no reason why this shouldn't be done for product evaluations. A good strategist, a friend of mine is a strategist for a large company, and when I was reviewing these slides with her, it kept being interesting again and again how similar alternative analysis is to strategic analysis and strategy theory. There's a lot there, and I keep meaning to go and dig into those groups and find more about it, but I haven't done so yet. Provide practice with dealing with classes of adversaries. You can use them as a sparring partner. This is what a red team should be. You should be able to say, look, we're interested in this kind of adversary, or hey, our defenders don't get a lot of practice in this kind of research or this kind of response. We should give them that space to practice. Maybe you've got some old VAX systems sitting around somewhere and your defenders have never actually had to do incident response with them. Better to practice while it's your choice versus an attacker's choice. Finally, finding gaps in any of your controls, any of your assumptions, any of your theory, any of the approach that you're implementing here. Where do they fail? The failures are broad, and I think that everyone is hearing some of these. Setting yourself up to be an adversary, either intentionally or unintentionally, insufficient support from management, overly constrained. How many of you have seen a penetration test or a red team engagement that says you can attack any? I'm going to keep the left arm behind here for now. How many of you have seen a pen test that says you can attack anything you want, but stay away from those systems because we can't risk them, and you can only do it during this downtime window, and oh, by the way, it needs to be the seventh son of a seventh son of a seventh daughter of somebody who died at birth, and it can only happen during a blue moon. But otherwise, we absolutely want perfect reality. Communication failures. This is where you need somebody who actually really is good at communication doing a lot of this. It is really hard to go in and tell somebody that their entire environment is hosed and that their incident responders are undertrained and do so in a fashion that leaves them saying thank you. But you really need to be able to do that. It is an essential skill. You want to know what the level of bad news you can provide to your defenders is. You don't want them to curl up in a ball and whimper. You want them to say, okay, I've got actionable things and I'm inspired to go fix them. Defending, the last one I think is worth calling out specifically, mistaking the red team for the enemy. This is something that there have been some great conversations in actually self-defense forums around, is you start modifying your actual defensive behaviors to deal with the modeled attack instead of the real attack. And you make this mistake of thinking that just because you have detected the red team, and I've seen this multiple times where the blue teams actually start using things like their ability to read laptops from the defender or from the attackers, and they'll go and look at the red team's laptops and use that as a way of figuring out that they're doing something. The red team is not the real enemy. Once you found the red team, you still have to deal with the live enemy. Any questions, by the way? Y'all are being real quiet. Okay. Anyone want to tell me about how you turn tryptophan into serotonin? I told you I'd ask questions. All right. Ways red team fail. Groupthink. This is a big one. If you have an entire team of people who are generally the same background, come from the same state, come from the same country, are the same gender, have the same education, how much separation of thought are you going to get? The fact is you're not going to get a lot. The last time I gave this talk, I ended up having a conversation with somebody about hiring, and we got into discussion of the problem of the statement, we want to hire people who fit in well with our team. If you hire people who fit in well with your team, which is a reasonable goal, It really is. There's a level of friction that just gets exhausting and it's miserable. But if you hire people who fit in well with your team, that means they're going to think the way your team thinks. You see the fundamental issue here? At the same time, if you have too much friction within your team, you're just going to break and it's not going to go anywhere. But these are the sorts of implicit things that come up, and unless you've got somebody who's going to point them out to you, you're not going to get anywhere. This is the place where I will say team diversity is highly valuable in and of itself, and it's worth hiring specifically for alternative skill sets. I've been thinking about how to hire people with finance backgrounds, people with economics backgrounds, people with anthropology backgrounds, all sorts of different backgrounds. And really, there's a tremendous value in doing so. You just have to figure out how to accommodate their way of thinking. You can't expect them to integrate specifically with your team, otherwise you're losing the value that you got them for. It's like acquiring a company and then saying function just like the company that we bought, or that we've bought you. So, general suggestions on building and using a red team. These slides are available online. I'm not going to make you go through the eye chart. You've heard most of my thoughts on this stuff, and given that we've now got a couple minutes left, I'm going to open it for questions. These are for red teaming in general. Collect diverse backgrounds, since people are squinting. Constant training is a necessity. Know when to stop. Like I said, you want them to feel inspired to do the work, not curl up in a ball and freak out. Alternative analysis suggestions. Find people who are good at finding flaws in their own logic, not just other people's, but their own. And most people are really bad at this. Read constantly about your adversaries. Read constantly about everything. The wider the range of topics, the better. Anything you can find is going to very likely be useful here. Political science tends to be an interesting space. The example I have in my speaker notes that I want to give an example for is, for instance, political science as a space. Most political scientists think that reneging on a treaty would be a horrific and bad thing, and that it's something that you should never do, and that the entire political science academic space would say this is a bizarre and horrible idea, and yet we have a full, I wouldn't say, I don't know, half, but a significant portion of the country and a president and administration right now who believes that this is a right and good thing, which means that somebody wasn't thinking it through properly from the academic perspective. Whether you agree with one side or the other, it means that they didn't give it enough thought and they didn't analyze it fully, because everyone said, well, of course, this is not what would happen. Nobody would play this game in this fashion. Other things. Adversary simulation. Be rigorous about defining the adversary you're simulating. Make sure you can justify why they are performing the attacks and why they have the information that they do and why they have the skills that they do. Be able to define which tools you're using, be able to explain all the characteristics. Mindset is going to be more important than technical knowledge, and finding red teamers, and technical knowledge is essential. But you have to get that mindset, and I'll give you a hint. If you go and find people who are really brilliant pen testers, they're actually pretty likely to not be great red teamers. It's a very different mindset. They're going to come from a very different place, and you're going to keep getting in their way because they're just going to want to break in and break in and break in. Other sorts of things. References. The slides are available online. I'll post the SlideShare link. Steve, I think you referred. Good.
So, Toby, I wanted to use a corollary of where they use red team in another completely different industry, which is in mergers, acquisitions, and government contracting, where the red team basically goes and looks at your assumptions and at your decisions and challenges each one of those. Can we apply that same model back to IT, where instead of going to find vulnerabilities, you're looking at the rules, the policies, the controls you've put in place, and challenging the assumptions and the decisions that were made? So red team the infrastructure from that policy perspective, not just from the technology. And can we learn from those other industries that have created this consistent process that we're going to invest in something, and then you have a separate group that goes and sees why we shouldn't invest? Should we be doing that as part of our red team exercise, or is that you think that's a different part?
That's actually interesting.
Sorry, can I add something from
Please.
Having worked in M&A? The red teaming is mostly like, how much can we pretend like we red teamed in order to make the management team feel like we did our job. So I'm not sure if it's the best model, but I just wanted to add that.
Yeah, no, actually.
But
so
the idea is sound.
Unfortunately, I really like the idea of using red teaming and alternative analysis against IT. Unfortunately, I think that you're going to run into the fact that the industry is basically full of everyone arguing on both sides of the topic in terms of IT. IT should be completely outsourced. IT should never be outsourced. IT should be in the cloud. Cloud is the future. Wait a minute, no, centralized computing is, I don't know, one after another. I think there's enough noise and argument there right now that I'm not sure that a red team could even get a word in edgewise. It's an interesting idea. I don't know how we would do it. Yeah.
Go back one slide. So be rigorous about defining the attacker you're simulating. I've been wanting to ask the question the entire presentation. How do you know what adversaries you intend to emulate, right? So what sort of analysis can you do as a company to actually determine, should I be looking at the APT28 or script kiddies?
So that's a really good point. There are a couple different ways, and there were other questions around as well. If you raise your hand, Kelly, would you hand that? Yeah. There are a number of ways. Obviously, the best is to open Forbes and find out what they're saying about which APT cares about you today. Not even a little laugh? All right. But no, the reality is that there's a lot of data on which attackers are focusing on which areas, and most of the malware actually comes from a perspective of, you can say, what industry is this targeting, where is it being used, how is it being played. You can also look at the forums. First is actually pretty good for talking about what's hitting defenders and therefore what kind of attackers they're dealing with. There's always the problem that the same tool can be used for multiple sources, and so trying to do the analysis of what the root cause actually is gets a little tricky there. And this is where it ends up being art as opposed to hard science. But first, ISAC, all of the sorts of things where you're going to get information about where attacks are actually being done. Other questions?
Do you wanna? My question is, how do you actually interview for this? How do you interview to test like someone else's perspective, like without getting totally dreadfully painful?
Oh God, I wish. Actually, that's not true. I have some ideas. There used to be a set of interview questions called the Jack of all trades, and they are essentially a set of non-technical interview questions that attempt to look at how somebody does mindset. And they're things like, there is a light bulb that is on, give us 10 ways to turn it off. And that's fairly interesting. One of the things that I like to do, and I am skeptical about the implicit biases and gaps that it produces, is I liked for a long time to make wrong statements and see if the person I was interviewing would disagree with me. The problem is that absolutely creates implicit assumptions about their behavior and setting them up if they are not the sort that's comfortable doing that, and lots of people aren't. It's a hard thing to interview for. I'm still trying to figure it out.
Yeah, you mentioned many characteristics about personality, mindset, ways of thinking. Often in innovation, it's very important also to set up the right, you kind of mentioned that also about the groupthink, but the right way to have people, the social characteristics, the way you're going to establish a team, a social team. And we're talking about red team. So what, your point of view, are the key things to create the right red team? And are there any ways to create the right red team?
So the key characteristic of creating the right red team, which model? Are we talking about red cell as in attacking, or are we talking about alternative analysis?
Oh, the first one.
Attack modeling. In my sense, I'll steal a quote, actually. There is a quote in Red Team by Micah Zenko. Many of the best red teamers are actors. And the reason you want somebody who is an actor is you want somebody who can really embrace and get into the mindset of the actual attacker. You don't want them thinking with their brain. You want them thinking with the attacker's brain. And I'd say probably understanding that you need technical expertise and understanding that you need them to have a bunch of other characteristics, having the ability to be a good actor, that's probably one of the key things that you want from anyone in this role. Because otherwise you're going to spend all your time behind you, forcing them to do that essentially. Yeah.
In today's more agile, high iteration environments where the development teams want to bring the InfoSec organization in early, should you keep your adversarial analysis fully separate from that, or actually bring them in so they can understand and actually become the challenge, become the 10th person in the room to discuss particular methodologies
Sure.
and or strategy?
I absolutely think it should be done early and often, and right there. And I would say that it is actually useful to integrate and teach within the teams, because you don't want the red team to be the only source of this thinking. There's been good discussion and research on how to temporarily rotate people into red teams, and I think that's highly effective, because you then build the skills in that individual and then put them back in the organization they're from. It's also one of the great ways to get people who have very different mindsets than what you may have full time, and be able to expose your team to a broader range of thinking.
All right. Thanks, Toby. All right. So remember, if you ask the question, from now on, I'm only going to give you the mic if I see that you have Slack up. All right? Come on, we gotta try to exercise some discipline here. All right, so we're at a break right now, but the reality is that the ops track does make it really hard for us to hear what's going on here. And more than likely, if we start talking during the ops track, they're gonna have trouble too. So we'll reconvene when the ops track starts up again, okay? So that we can synchronize and make sure that folks are quiet. We'll restart when the ops track starts, okay?